Sometime in 1930, a microphone was set up at a Confederate veterans reunion in Richmond, Virginia. The men gathered around it were old, most of them in their 80s, some past 90, the last living soldiers who had served in the Army of Northern Virginia when it was the most feared fighting force on the continent. They had been asked to do something specific, to recreate the sound they had made in battle. The sound that appears in hundreds of Union soldier letters and memoirs, always described with some version of the same conclusion, that no language quite captured it. What came out of those old men was something between a yelp and a wail, high-pitched and sustained, rising at the end like a question that never gets answered. Researchers have spent decades studying that recording. The Smithsonian analyzed it. Historians have compared it against written accounts, and tried to reconstruct the acoustic reality of something that was, by 1930, already 65 years gone. The consensus, such as it exists, is that the recording gives us the shape of the rebel yell but almost none of its substance. Because what those elderly men produced in a quiet Virginia room is not, cannot possibly be, what it sounded like when 12,000 soldiers screamed it across nearly a mile of open Pennsylvania farmland on the hottest afternoon of July 3, 1863. That gap between what we can hear on the recording and what actually happened at Gettysburg is the thing that haunts Civil War historians. Not simply because the sound is lost, sounds are always lost, but because of what it meant, who it belonged to, and the specific way it marked both the peak of Confederate military power and the beginning of its unraveling, both things contained in the same hour, carried in the same scream. The men who made that charge were not abstractions. They were mostly young. The average Confederate soldier in Pickett's division was in his mid-20s, and many of them had enlisted in the first wave of 1861, when the war was new and the general belief on the Confederate side was that it would be over in months. 2 years later, they knew better. They had seen enough battles, buried enough friends, and spent enough winters in inadequate camps to have shed every romantic notion the war had started with. What they had kept, because something in a soldier has to be kept or the whole enterprise falls apart, was the belief that the Army of Northern Virginia specifically was different from other armies, that Lee's army could do things other armies could not, that the men in it had a quality the Union Army had never been able to match for sustained aggression and tactical flexibility. That belief was not unfounded. It was built from 2 years of evidence. By the summer of 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia had been making that sound for 2 years. It first drew serious attention at the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, when Confederate soldiers chasing the retreating Union Army across the fields of Northern Virginia produced it at sufficient volume that some Union soldiers described hearing it from nearly a mile away as something close to physical, a sound felt in the chest before it registered in the ears. It got louder at the 7 days battles. It was present at Second Bull Run, at Fredericksburg, at Chancellorsville, that last battle just 2 months before Gettysburg, where the army swept through the Union right flank with a force that felt, to the people on the receiving end, like a natural disaster that had learned to use a human voice. The rebel yell was not standard issue from any army manual. Nobody ordered Confederate soldiers to make it and nobody taught them how. It emerged from something harder to locate in the historical record, from the culture these men came from the fox hunts and cattle drives and shouting rituals of the rural South, from some convergence of Scots-Irish settler traditions and the particular intensity of men who believed, at least in those early years, that they were fighting for their own ground against an invader. Different units produced it differently. Men from Virginia described a different pitch than men from the Carolinas. Texas regiments had their own version. What made it identifiable across all those regional variations was not uniformity but the opposite, the raw, uncoordinated quality of thousands of individual voices doing something similar but not identical, all at once, in a way that hit the ear as a single terrifying wave. Union soldiers tried to describe it and mostly failed. The words they reached for were always insufficient, unearthly, strange, wild, terrible. A New York soldier who had fought at Chancellorsville wrote that you felt it in your chest before you heard it with your ears, which reads like a literary flourish until you find 15 other men from 15 other units saying essentially the same thing. Something about the combination of pitch and volume and raw human intensity produced an effect that bypassed the analytical brain entirely and went straight to the part that calculates survival odds. George Pickett understood the yell the way a man understands the tools of his profession. Pickett was 48 years old on July 3, 1863, vain, ambitious, hungry for the kind of glory that the war had so far distributed to other men. He had graduated last in his West Point class in 1846, a fact his admirers considered charming and his detractors considered diagnostic. He had served with some distinction in Mexico and in the Pacific Northwest, but the Civil War had opened in Virginia and Pickett had spent most of it in secondary roles, watching men like A.P. Hill and Stonewall Jackson accumulated the reputations he wanted for himself. His division had not fought at Chancellorsville. By the time the Army of Northern Virginia crossed into Pennsylvania in June of 1863, Pickett was 30 years into a military career and still looking for his defining moment. July 3rd was going to be his defining moment. Just not in the way he imagined. The plan, conceived by Robert E. Lee, objected to with unusual persistence by James Longstreet, and executed anyway, called for Pickett's 3 brigades to form the right side of an assault column of roughly 12,000 men that would cross the open ground between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge, reach the stone wall near a distinctive stand of trees on the Union line, break through the Union center, and cut the Army of the Potomac in half. Longstreet, who had spent 2 years watching frontal assaults against prepared positions produce nothing except Confederate casualties in quantities the Army could not afford to replace, told Lee with uncharacteristic directness that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle could take that position. Lee told him to execute the order. The ground between the 2 ridges was the problem stated plainly. The distance from the Confederate line in the Seminary Ridge tree line to the Union position along Cemetery Ridge was somewhere between 3/4 of a mile and a full mile, depending on the point of measurement. It was open agricultural land, gently rolling, with no cover of any consequence and no terrain features that could shield a formation from direct fire. Union artillery had ranged every yard of it. Union infantry along the stone wall had nothing to do but wait. The Confederate assault would have to dress ranks, advance in formation across that entire distance under artillery fire, absorb musketry from roughly 200 yards out, and arrive at the stone wall with enough men and enough remaining cohesion to climb over it. The mathematics of the situation did not favor the attacker. Longstreet had read the mathematics correctly. Before the infantry moved, there was the artillery preparation. The Confederate barrage on the afternoon of July 3rd assembled somewhere between 150 and 170 cannon along a 2-mile front, the largest concentration of artillery the Confederate Army had ever positioned at a single point in the war. It opened at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon and continued for nearly 2 hours. The sound carried to Pittsburgh, more than 150 miles away. Men in Pickett's division, lying in the Seminary Ridge tree line waiting for the signal, pressed their hands over their ears while the ground shook and shrapnel cut through the branches above their heads. The heat was close to 90 degrees with the kind of mid-Atlantic humidity that makes artillery smoke hang low rather than clearing. The men lying in that timber were soaked through before the advance began. The Confederate barrage mostly overshot its targets. The Union artillery chief Henry Hunt had ordered his gunners to fall silent partway through the exchange, creating the impression that Confederate fire had suppressed the Union batteries, while in reality Hunt was simply conserving ammunition. When Pickett's infantry stepped out of the tree line at approximately 3 in the afternoon and began dressing their lines for the advance, the Union guns behind Cemetery Ridge were loaded, laid, and waiting. For a few moments after the Confederate formations emerged, the field was quiet. The artillery exchange had stopped. The men stood in formation in the afternoon heat, their battle flags catching a slight breeze, looking across 3/4 of a mile of open ground at the Union position on the ridge. Multiple Confederate accounts describe this interval, a span of perhaps 2 minutes, with an almost suspended quality, as if the afternoon had paused. The long gray lines were dressed. The officers were in position. The flags were straight. The ground ahead was silent. Then the order came. The formations began to move. What the men in Pickett's division experienced in those first moments of the advance, when the lines were still dressed, the flags still perfectly spaced, the sergeants still calling alignment, was a suspension of ordinary fear that soldiers who have written about similar experiences describe as one of the stranger aspects of battle. The waiting before an assault is almost always described as worse than the advance itself. Once movement begins, the body commits and the mind follows. The thing you have been imagining becomes the thing you are simply doing, and the doing crowds out the imagining. Men who had been lying in the Seminary Ridge timber for 2 hours thinking about what was on the other side of that field stood up and walked forward and found that the walking itself reorganized something in them. Several accounts suggest the rebel yell rose before the men had moved 20 steps. Others placed it later, when the formation had covered a third of the distance. Some Confederate officers stated their men had been instructed to advance in silence as long as possible, to deny the Union defenders the psychological preparation that hearing the yell from a distance provided. Whether the instructions were given or not, maintaining silence across 3/4 of a mile of open ground with cannon fire coming in was probably beyond what any officer could actually enforce. The yell was not something Confederate soldiers switched on and off by command. It was something that happened when a man's body decided the moment had arrived. Because the rebel yell was not simply a sound made at the enemy. The men who studied it most carefully, including the musicologists and acoustic researchers who attempted reconstruction decades after the war, identified something that the soldiers themselves understood without the vocabulary to describe it technically. The specific vocal mechanics of the yell, the high initial pitch, the sustained quality, the way it built as more voices joined it, produced a measurable physiological effect on the men generating it. Heart rate elevated. Pain sensitivity dropped. Focus narrowed to the immediate task. These are the physiological signatures of an adrenaline state that the yell was not merely accompanying but actively inducing. In the modern language of performance science, it was a chemical trigger disguised as a battle cry. In the language of the men who used it, it was just what you did when you went forward. Going forward without it felt like going into the dark alone. On July 3rd, they were walking into something considerably worse than dark. The Union artillery opened when the Confederate formation was at roughly 200 yards, the range at which the canister was most effective. Hunt had preserved his ammunition exactly for this. What the advancing Confederate lines ran into was not simply cannon fire but a series of metal storms, each Union gun firing canister that spread on discharge like a massive shotgun blast, each blast cutting a swath through the packed formation. The ground around the Confederate advance began filling with dead and wounded almost immediately. Men were falling not by ones and twos but in rows. The formations came apart at the edges first. Kemper's brigade on the Confederate right and Pettigrew's division on the left took enfilade fire from Union positions on the flanks, fire that traveled along the length of the Confederate line rather than into its face, one projectile potentially passing through 6 or 7 men in sequence before it spent itself. Officers who had ridden into battle on horseback became the most visible targets on the field. Richard Garnett, one of Pickett's brigade commanders, was sick with a fever and too weak to walk. He had ridden into the advance on horseback, which put him 6 feet above the heads of the men around him in a field where anything above the infantry line was a natural aiming point. He was shot from his horse and died there. His body was never conclusively identified. The formation still came forward. What Confederate survivors described in their letters and memoirs from that crossing, the middle part of it, when the casualties were already severe but the line was still moving, was a state that sits somewhere at the intersection of terror and detachment. The yell was not optional by this point. It was the one connection each man had to the men beside him in the smoke and the noise. You could not see clearly in any direction. You could not hear individual voices or orders. What you could hear was the collective sound of the advance, the yell rising and falling in waves as men fell and others took their place, and that sound was the only evidence available to any individual soldier that the charge was still happening, that the man to his left and the man to his right had not stopped. As long as the sound continued, the charge continued. As long as the charge continued, there was still something to be part of. The Union soldiers behind the stone wall heard it coming before they saw the men making it. Winfield Scott Hancock, commanding the Union 2nd Corps at the center of the line, described the advancing Confederate formation as the most magnificent sight he had ever witnessed on a battlefield, and he had been present at enough of them to understand exactly what he was conceding by saying it. The alignment of the Confederate lines was precise enough to draw genuine admiration from the men who were loading their rifles to destroy it. The flags came forward in a line that seemed to stretch the full width of the horizon. The sound that accompanied the formation was audible across the entire ridge, arriving ahead of the men themselves, spreading along the Union position like a warning. Union soldiers who had heard the rebel yell before, veterans of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and a dozen smaller engagements, described a specific response to hearing it again. Men who had told themselves and each other that they were past being frightened by it found their hands tightening on their rifles in ways that had nothing to do with conscious choice. One soldier from the 1st Minnesota Infantry wrote that when the sound reached him it was as if the war had been compressed into a single noise and that noise had found him specifically. The 1st Minnesota had been nearly destroyed 2 days earlier on July 2nd, thrown into a gap in the Union line to buy 15 minutes of time at a cost of over 2/3 of their strength. They were still in the line with barely 200 men. When the sound of Pickett's advance hit them, they were already men who had been to the edge. The Vermont brigades on the Confederate flanks opened fire. The rifles along the stone wall opened fire. The Confederate formation, which had been shrinking since it left the tree line, began shrinking much faster. Men in the front ranks fell in numbers that made the ground uneven, and the men behind them stepped over the bodies to keep moving. Armistead reached the wall. Lewis Armistead, commanding the brigade that penetrated deepest into the Union position, had placed his black hat on the tip of his sword so his men could follow him through the smoke. He had been one of the most respected officers in the Army of Northern Virginia, steady, experienced, the kind of man whose composure communicated itself to the soldiers around him as something they could lean on. He went over the stone wall with roughly 200 men. Behind him. He crossed the Union line. He put his hand on a cannon. He was shot twice while turning to bring his men forward, and he fell. He died 2 days later in a Union field hospital. He was 51 years old. The Union general who commanded the position Armistead broke through was Winfield Hancock, his closest friend from before the war. They never spoke again. The 200 men who crossed the wall with Armistead, the survivors who actually penetrated the Union position for the 3 or 4 minutes that the breakthrough lasted, were described by Union defenders as still making the yell when they came over. Still producing the sound, in close combat, inside the Union line. Some continued it while fighting with bayonets and rifle butts in the crowded space behind the wall, in those terrible minutes when the charge had technically succeeded and was simultaneously failing, when the men who had reached the objective found themselves enclosed on 3 sides by the weight of a Union corps that had been specifically organized to meet them. The rebel yell in that enclosed space, in those final seconds, among those final men, is the part historians cannot reconstruct. The soldiers who produced it there were mostly dead within the minute. The handful who survived and made it back to Seminary Ridge were too shattered in the immediate aftermath to produce coherent accounts of what those last moments felt like from the inside. What was screamed at the wall, what was said and what was felt in the brief chaotic minutes when a few hundred men were surrounded and fighting and dying inside the Union line, exists in the record only through the accounts of Union defenders, men who were looking in from the outside, describing what they witnessed from the perspective of people who were ending the lives of those producing the sound. The Confederate interior experience of those final seconds is gone. What we are left with is the shape that absence makes in the record. The historical documentation of Pickett's charge is, in one sense, exceptionally thorough. More has been written about those 50 minutes more than about almost any comparable engagement in American military history. The after-action reports filed by Union officers are detailed and careful. The post-war memoirs produced by Confederate survivors, men like James Kemper, who was carried from the field and spent months recovering from his wounds before eventually becoming governor of Virginia, add granular detail about what the advance looked like from within. The newspaper correspondents on both sides who covered Gettysburg produced dispatches of real descriptive quality. The topography of the field itself has been preserved and studied in extraordinary detail. We can tell you, with reasonable precision, where almost every significant unit was at almost every significant moment during those 50 minutes. What the documentation cannot give back is the sensory reality of the thing. Pickett watched it from Seminary Ridge. He stood with his binoculars and watched his division disappear into the smoke and the fire, and when the survivors came back, the men walking slowly across the field now, coming back in fragments and clusters, many of them leaving blood trails in the July grass, he turned to Lee and said that his division had been destroyed. Lee told him to rally his men for a possible Union counterattack. Pickett said, "General Lee, I have no division." He never forgave Lee. He barely spoke of Gettysburg for the rest of his life, and when he did, it carried no trace of the nostalgia that other Confederate officers brought to their memories of the great battles. It carried something rawer and less processable, the bitterness of a man who was handed his moment and watched his moment consume everything he had built his career to command. Out of the roughly 12,000 men who crossed that field, more than half became casualties in under an hour. Pickett's own 3 Virginia brigades lost somewhere between 60 and 70% of their strength. All 15 regimental commanders in Pickett's division who advanced across the ground were killed or wounded. All 15. Acoustic researchers who have attempted to model what the rebel yell of Pickett's charge sounded like at full volume, using the 1930 recordings as a baseline, scaled to the documented size of the assault column, projected across open ground with the day's wind conditions, have produced estimates suggesting the sound would have been audible more than 2 miles away at above threshold intensity. Union soldiers positioned more than a mile from the assault reported hearing it clearly. Civilians sheltering in cellars in Gettysburg, more than 2 miles distant, heard it through stone walls and earth. The 1930 recording is held at the Library of Congress. You can listen to it any time you want. Old men doing their best to give you something across 6 decades of distance. The sound they make is genuinely strange, nothing like any other battle cry on record, nothing that maps cleanly onto any military tradition. It rises at the end in a way that feels less like aggression than like something suspended between a question and an appeal. Maybe that is the most accurate thing about the recording. Those old men in 1930 had lived through everything that followed Gettysburg, the retreat back into Virginia, the grinding 2-year Confederate defeat, the end at Appomattox Courthouse, and then the longer defeat of the post-war decades, poverty, occupation, the slow mythology building that tried to retroactively reclaim as noble tragedy what had been a catastrophic political and military failure. By 1930 they were the last men alive who had actually done the thing, and they could not know what it had led to. They could not recreate the sound of men who still believed they were going to win. The recording carries that knowledge whether they intended it to or not. It sounds like a memory. It sounds like elegy. On July 3, 1863, at approximately 3 in the afternoon, the men who made the charge had none of that knowledge. They stepped out of the tree line into the summer sunlight with the whole field still ahead of them, the yell rising from 12,000 throats into the Pennsylvania heat, and they went forward into something they did not fully understand. That is the version of the sound that has never been recorded and never will be. Made by people who were still entirely inside the belief that this was going to work, that the Army of Northern Virginia was going to split the Union Center and change the war, that this particular July afternoon was the afternoon everything turned. The afternoon did turn. Just not in the direction they were facing. The afternoon did turn. Just not in the direction they were facing. One dimension of the charge that rarely gets acknowledged in the standard Gettysburg narrative, the men who made the charge knew, or should have known from the evidence available to them, that the odds were against them. The casualty rates from frontal assaults against prepared positions were well established by the summer of 1863. Every man in that formation had seen what happened at Fredericksburg, where Union infantry attacked uphill toward Confederate positions at Marye's Heights and was cut apart in successive waves without ever reaching the wall. The tactical situation at Gettysburg on July 3 was not meaningfully different from the tactical situation at Fredericksburg, except that at Gettysburg, it was Confederate soldiers doing the attacking. They were not ignorant men. They could see the ground. They had the same access to 2 years of experience that Longstreet had when he told Lee the assault would fail. They went anyway. That combination, knowledge and forward movement in the face of knowledge, is the other thing the yell was carrying across that field. Not just the suppression of fear but a specific kind of commitment to the thing already begun, a refusal to be stopped by the understanding of what stopping meant and what continuing meant equally. It doesn't fit cleanly into any category we use to describe human behavior in extremity. It isn't courage in the simple sense, because courage usually implies a choice. By the time those men were 200 yards out with canisters cutting through the formation on both sides, there was no meaningful choice available. It is something else. Call it momentum, call it belonging, call it the particular gravity of men who are part of something larger than their individual survival calculation. The yell was the sound of that gravity. And it is the sound that historians keep reaching for and cannot quite touch. And the sound they made in the last moments before they understood that, unburdened, forward-facing, carrying no knowledge of the next hour, is the sound that sits at the center of what historians mean when they say Gettysburg haunts them. Not the tactics and the terrain and the commander's decisions, as endlessly interesting as those are. The sound. The specific, irretrievable sound of people who did not know yet what was about to happen to them, going forward anyway, screaming. Some things the archive cannot hold. The silence where that sound used to be is one of them. And the longer you study the battle, the louder that silence gets. Thank you for watching. Always like, share and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any update from us.